Rotting royalty, the shocking truth about King Henry VIII's decomposing body and paranoid mind. The year was 1546, and something was terribly wrong in the halls of Windsor Castle. Servants hurried past a particular corridor with handkerchiefs pressed firmly against their faces, their eyes watering from an odour so putrid it seemed to seep through stone walls themselves. The smell wasn't coming from the castle's kitchens or sewers. It was emanating from the royal chambers of Henry VIII, King of England, defender of the faith, and arguably the most powerful man in Europe. But power, as Henry was discovering in his final years, could not save a body from its own corruption. The man who once danced until dawn and jousted with the finest knights of his realm had become something far more terrifying than any medieval monster. His body, swollen to grotesque proportions, was literally rotting while he still drew breath. Weeping ulcers covered his legs like a map of decay, each wound a testament to a metabolism gone catastrophically wrong. The young, athletic prince, who had ascended to the throne at 18, had transformed into a 400-pound nightmare whose very presence cleared rooms not from royal protocol, but from the unbearable stench of living death. Yet this physical decomposition was merely the external manifestation of a mind that had long since begun its own form of decay. Henry's paranoia had reached such heights that he saw assassins in shadows, poison in every meal, and treachery in every whispered conversation. The same king who had once trusted advisers enough to let them reshape England's religious landscape now suspected his own children of plotting his demise. His court had become a theatre of terror, where a misplaced word could mean death, and where the line between justified caution and delusional madness had been obliterated by years of absolute power wielded by an increasingly unstable mind. This is not the Henry VIII of romantic legend or simplified history books. This is the reality of a tyrant's final descent, a story of flesh failing, sanity crumbling, and a kingdom held hostage by one man's spectacular disintegration. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Decay. The transformation began subtly, as most destructions do. In 1536, during what should have been a routine jousting match at Greenwich, Henry VIII's horse collapsed on top of him, driving the full-armoured king into the frozen ground with devastating force. For 2 hours, the future of England hung in the balance as physicians frantically worked over their unconscious monarch. When Henry finally opened his eyes, something fundamental had changed. The jovial, if temperamental king began exhibiting mood swings so severe that courtiers started marking their calendars by his temperament. But it was Henry's body that would become the most visible testament to his decline. By 1546, his waist measured 54 inches, larger than most people's height. His legs, once powerful enough to carry him through hours of energetic dancing, had become columns of infected flesh. The ulcers that appeared following his jousting accident never healed. Instead, they grew larger, deeper, more putrid with each passing month. "The smell precedes His Majesty by several chambers," whispered one unnamed courtier in a letter that survived the centuries. Medical experts today believe these weren't simple wounds, but manifestations of osteomyelitis, a bone infection that would have caused excruciating pain while producing the characteristic sweet, rotten odor that made Henry's presence so immediately detectable. The king's daily routine became a carefully choreographed dance around his disabilities. Each morning, a team of servants would arrive with special padded clothing designed to absorb the constant seepage from his wounds. They worked in shifts, as no one could tolerate the close proximity required for dressing the king for more than a few minutes at a time. The servants drew lots to determine who would have the misfortune of handling his legs, and it was considered such an ordeal that extra wages were provided as compensation. Henry's mobility became increasingly dependent on mechanical devices. A special chair equipped with pulleys and wheels was constructed to transport him, but even this accommodation couldn't prevent the horrifying reality that pieces of infected tissue would occasionally fall from his body during transport. Palace records show payments to cleaners specifically assigned to follow in the king's wake, removing biological debris from carpets and floors. The psychological impact of this physical deterioration cannot be understated. Here was a man who had defined himself through physical prowess, reduced to requiring assistance for the most basic functions. His legendary appetite, once a sign of his vitality, became a grotesque spectacle as he consumed thousands of calories daily while barely able to move. The disconnect between his enormous intake and minimal activity created a feedback loop of obesity and infection that modern medicine recognizes as a perfect storm for metabolic disaster. Perhaps most tellingly, Henry began to blame his condition on external forces rather than acknowledging its medical reality. He convinced himself that his enemies were somehow poisoning him slowly, that his wives were cursing him through witchcraft, that his very nobility made him a target for supernatural attack. This refusal to accept the mundane truth of his body's failure would fuel the paranoid delusions that would define his final years and terrorize everyone around him. Chapter 2. The Fortress of Fear. Henry's physical deterioration walked hand in hand with a paranoia so consuming that it transformed England's royal court into something resembling a medieval surveillance state. By 1544, the king trusted no one, not his advisors, not his servants, not even his own children. Every conversation was potentially treasonous, every gesture a possible threat, every meal a potential assassination attempt. The sleeping arrangements alone revealed the depth of Henry's fear. His bedchamber became a fortress within a fortress. Multiple loaded crossbows were positioned within arm's reach of his bed, along with an array of daggers hidden beneath his pillows. But this wasn't enough. Armed guards were stationed inside the room itself, watching him sleep throughout the night. Imagine the psychological toll of being so terrified of assassination that you couldn't even close your eyes without witnesses. Henry's paranoia extended to elaborate architectural modifications throughout his palaces. He ordered the construction of secret passages connecting every room he frequented, not for romantic rendezvous, but as escape routes from potential assassins. Spy holes were drilled into walls so he could observe his courtiers without their knowledge. He installed primitive listening devices, essentially hollow tubes running through walls, to eavesdrop on private conversations in adjacent chambers. The king's relationship with food became a theater of paranoia. Every morsel that entered his mouth was first tested by multiple food tasters, but Henry's suspicions ran deeper than simple poison detection. He demanded that his tasters wait 30 minutes after consuming each dish before he would touch it, reasoning that delayed action poisons might take time to manifest. The preparation of royal meals became a military operation, with guards posted at every stage of the cooking process and ingredients tested by different servants to prevent coordinated poisoning attempts. Perhaps most disturbing was Henry's creation of a network of spies tasked with watching his other spies. He recognized that informants could be bought or turned, So he established multiple overlapping surveillance systems where no one knew who else might be reporting on them. Courtiers began to suspect their closest friends of being royal informants, creating an atmosphere of such pervasive mistrust that normal social interaction became nearly impossible. The psychological warfare Henry waged extended to his own family. He had Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, his own daughters, watched by spies, convinced they were plotting to overthrow him. These were young women in their teens and early 20s, and Henry treated them as potential enemy agents. His son Edward, still a child, was similarly monitored. The future King of England grew up knowing that his father's agents were reporting on his every word and action. Henry's paranoia reached such extremes that he began executing people not for crimes they had committed, but for crimes he believed they might commit in the future. Thomas Cromwell, his own chief minister and one of the architects of the English Reformation, was executed partly because Henry dreamed that Cromwell had betrayed him. The king's nightmares became death sentences for real people. The most chilling aspect of this paranoid system was how it became self-perpetuating. As Henry's suspicions grew more extreme, people actually did begin to plot against him, not out of treachery, but out of desperate self-preservation. The very surveillance state he created to protect himself generated the genuine conspiracies he feared, creating a horrifying feedback loop where paranoia bred actual betrayal, which justified even more extreme paranoia. Chapter 3. The Theatre of Matrimonial Terror. While history remembers Henry VIII's 6 marriages as a tale of romantic excess, the reality was far darker, a systematic campaign of psychological torture that revealed the king's capacity for intimate cruelty. His treatment of his wives went far beyond the simple brutality of execution. It was a calculated program of emotional destruction that demonstrated how absolute power could corrupt even the most personal relationships. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, endured perhaps the cruelest psychological warfare. Henry didn't simply divorce her, he orchestrated a campaign to destroy her identity entirely. After 18 years of marriage, he declared that their union had never been valid in God's eyes, effectively erasing nearly 2 decades of her life. But the cruelty went deeper. He separated her from their daughter Mary, denying them any contact for the final years of Catherine's life. Palace records show that Catherine wrote dozens of letters to Henry, begging to see Mary just once before she died. He never responded to a single one. The imprisonment was both physical and psychological. Catherine was confined to Kimbolton Castle, a deliberately uncomfortable residence where the roof leaked, the walls were damp, and the cold was so penetrating that her Spanish servants begged to return home. Henry's agents monitored her every movement, read her correspondence, and reported on her conversations with visitors. She died alone, possibly poisoned, writing a final letter to Henry signed Catherine the Queen, a defiant assertion of an identity he had tried to erase. Anne Boleyn's fate was even more psychologically brutal. Henry didn't merely decide to execute her. He crafted an elaborate fiction that destroyed her reputation while torturing her emotionally. He forced her to watch as 5 men, including her own brother George, were executed on charges of adultery with her. The accusations were almost certainly fabricated, but Henry made Anne witness the death of innocent people, supposedly caused by her imaginary sins. The psychological torture continued right up to her execution. Henry commissioned a special executioner from France, supposedly as a mercy, because the French method was supposedly quicker. But he delayed the execution multiple times, keeping Anne in the Tower of London in a state of constant terror, never knowing if each day would be her last. When she was finally executed, Henry was already planning his next marriage to Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting, who had been secretly courting him during Anne's imprisonment. Catherine Howard's ordeal revealed Henry's capacity for breathtaking cruelty toward youth and inexperience. She was barely 20 when she married him, and her previous romantic relationships were typical of any teenager. But Henry treated her sexual history as a personal betrayal worthy of death. He passed a law making it treason for anyone to marry the king without revealing their complete sexual history, essentially making Catherine's execution retroactively legal. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect was how Henry turned Catherine's own household against her. He offered rewards to her servants for revealing details about her past, creating an environment where she couldn't trust anyone around her. Her own ladies-in-waiting were reporting her private conversations and personal habits to the king's investigators. She spent her final weeks unable to confide in anyone, surrounded by people she had considered friends who were now actively working toward her destruction. Anne of Cleves represented a different kind of cruelty, the humiliation of public rejection. Henry took one look at her and declared the marriage unconsummated due to her supposed physical repulsiveness. But rather than simply divorce her, he forced her to participate in an elaborate charade, making her sign documents agreeing that their marriage had never been valid, while simultaneously requiring her to thank him publicly for his generous treatment. She had to pretend to be grateful for her own humiliation. The pattern was always the same. Henry would shower his new wife with attention and gifts, creating an illusion of security and love. Then when his interest waned or political circumstances changed, he would systematically destroy not just their marriage, but their entire sense of self. His wives weren't just discarded. They were psychologically dismantled with the same methodical precision he applied to religious reformations or military campaigns. Chapter 4. The Gluttony of Giants. Henry VIII's relationship with food evolved from royal indulgence to grotesque spectacle, revealing a man whose appetites had grown as monstrous as his suspicions. By the 1540s, his daily consumption had reached levels that modern nutritionists would consider physically impossible. Yet somehow, Henry not only survived, but demanded even more elaborate culinary excess with each passing month. A typical day's consumption for the king included approximately 5,000 calories, more than double what even an active adult male should consume, and Henry was decidedly inactive by this point. But the sheer quantity was only part of the horror. His meals had become theatrical performances where the king's bloated form dominated a table groaning under the weight of entire roasted animals, towers of bread, and lakes of wine that would make Roman emperors seem modest by comparison. The morning routine began with what Henry called his breaking fast, a meal that would constitute a full day's eating for most people. Multiple whole chickens, sides of beef, fresh fish brought daily from the coast, wheels of cheese, loaves of bread still warm from palace ovens, and quantities of ale that would fell a working man. But Henry was just getting started. This elaborate production was merely preparation for the day's main entertainment, dinner. Henry's dinner spectacles required a staff of over 200 kitchen workers operating in shifts around the clock. The kitchens at Hampton Court were redesigned multiple times to accommodate the scale of production required for royal meals. Entire pigs were roasted on spits so large they required multiple servants to turn them. Elaborate sugar sculptures, some weighing hundreds of pounds, were constructed for single meals and then destroyed the same day. The waste alone could have fed a small town, but waste was part of the point. Henry's meals were demonstrations of power as much as acts of consumption. The paranoid element of Henry's eating habits added another layer of absurdity to these already grotesque displays. Every dish was tested by multiple food tasters, but Henry's suspicions ran so deep that he required different tasters for different components of the same dish. The salt was tested separately from the meat, the sauce separately from the vegetables, creating a Byzantine system of quality control that turned every meal into an hour-long security screening. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was Henry's belief in the magical properties of certain foods. He was convinced that consuming swan would make him more graceful, ironic for a man who could barely walk. He believed that eating large quantities of venison would improve his hunting abilities, despite being unable to mount a horse. Most disturbing of all, he consumed massive quantities of oysters, believing they would restore his sexual potency, creating grotesque scenes where the rotting king would slurp down dozens of shellfish while his infected legs leaked onto the dining room floor. The king's meals became endurance tests for his courtiers, who were required to attend these spectacles regardless of their own appetites or tolerance for the smells emanating from Henry's decaying body. Dinner could last 4 hours, with Henry methodically working his way through course after course while engaging in rambling monologues about his divine right to rule, his sexual prowess, or his suspicions about various courtiers. Guests learned to eat sparingly themselves, as the combination of Henry's odor and his grotesque eating habits made it difficult for anyone else to maintain their appetite. The psychological dimension of Henry's gluttony revealed itself in his table conversation. He would often discuss the executions of former friends while carving meat, drawing explicit parallels between the dismemberment of animals and the dismemberment of traitors. He described the textures of various foods using the same language he applied to torture, creating an atmosphere where eating became inseparable from thoughts of violence and death. Perhaps most telling was how Henry's eating habits reflected his approach to everything else in his life: excessive, paranoid, wasteful, and ultimately self-destructive. The man who could consume enough food for 10 people daily while barely moving was the same man who could execute 2 wives, break with Rome, and systematically destroy anyone who questioned his judgment, all while convinced that his actions were not only justified, but divinely inspired. Chapter 5. The Final Corruption. By January 1547, Henry VIII had become something unprecedented in royal history, a living corpse whose body was failing so spectacularly that even his own physicians were too terrified to acknowledge the obvious truth. The king, who had once been the most powerful man in Europe, was now a prisoner of flesh, so corrupted that death would come as a relief, not just to him, but to everyone forced to witness his final deterioration. The physical reality of Henry's last weeks defied medical comprehension. His weight had ballooned to an estimated 400 pounds, but this wasn't merely obesity, it was systemic organ failure manifesting as grotesque swelling. His legs, already ravaged by years of infected ulcers, had become so enormous that custom furniture had to be constructed just to support them. The wounds no longer simply wept pus. They actively shed pieces of necrotic tissue that servants had to collect and dispose of multiple times daily. The smell had become so overwhelming that even hardened palace physicians, men accustomed to medieval medical horrors, had to leave his chambers to vomit. Contemporary accounts describe the odor as detectable from several rooms away, a sweet, rotting stench that seemed to permeate stone walls themselves. Henry's clothing had to be changed multiple times daily, not for cleanliness, but because the constant seepage from his wounds would soak through multiple layers of fabric within hours. His mobility had become entirely dependent on mechanical assistance. The special wheelchair constructed for him required multiple servants to operate, and even then, moving Henry from room to room became a traumatic experience for everyone involved. The chair's padding had to be replaced daily due to contamination, and the servants who operated it developed their own rotation system because prolonged exposure to the king's condition was considered a form of punishment duty. Perhaps most horrifying was how Henry's mental state deteriorated alongside his physical condition. His paranoia reached such heights that he began seeing assassins in reflections, hearing conspirators in the wind, and detecting poison in foods that hadn't even been prepared yet. He would wake from fever dreams, screaming about traitors and demanding immediate executions of people who existed only in his hallucinations. The death itself was as grotesque as the life that preceded it. On January 28, 1547, Henry's breathing became increasingly labored as his lungs struggled against the pressure of his swollen abdomen. His final words were reportedly a whispered conversation with imaginary advisors about executing someone whose name witnesses couldn't understand. He died alone, except for medical attendants, as even his closest courtiers had found excuses to be elsewhere during his final hours. But death couldn't end Henry's capacity for causing chaos. His body had become so swollen with internal gases that it posed immediate logistical challenges. The corpse had to be wrapped in lead sheets and sealed in multiple wooden caskets. But even these precautions proved insufficient. During the funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, the impossible happened. The coffin exploded. The build-up of decomposition gases created pressure that the lead lining couldn't contain. The coffin burst open during transport, spilling royal remains onto the floor of the hearse and creating a stench so overwhelming that the funeral procession had to halt while servants cleaned the mess with buckets and rags. According to witnesses, the smell was so powerful that horses refused to approach the carriage, and several mourners collapsed from the fumes. The final indignity came at Windsor Castle itself. The grave had to be dug extra wide and deep to accommodate the massive reinforced coffin, but the ground kept collapsing under the weight. Multiple attempts were required just to get Henry's remains into the earth and keep them there. Even after burial, groundskeepers reported strange sounds and odors emanating from the grave site for months afterward, the king's body apparently continuing to decompose so actively that it generated detectable evidence of its corruption even through several feet of soil. Conclusion: the true horror of Henry VIII lies not in any single act of cruelty or moment of excess, but in the systematic way absolute power corrupted absolutely every aspect of his existence. His body rotted while he still lived, his mind descended into paranoid delusion, and his kingdom became a theatre for one man's spectacular disintegration. Yet perhaps most disturbing of all is how Henry never recognized his own monstrosity, convinced until his final breath that his actions were justified, his suspicions warranted, and his failures the fault of everyone except himself. This was the reality behind the legend, not a charismatic king with a complicated love life, but a man whose unchecked authority transformed him into something genuinely inhuman. His legacy wasn't just the English Reformation or the precedent of royal divorce, but a masterclass in how power without accountability inevitably creates monsters. Henry VIII didn't just rule England, he held it hostage to his own psychological and physical decay, proving that sometimes the most terrifying tyrants are those who destroy themselves while destroying everything around them. The rotting king died as he had lived in his final years, causing chaos, spreading corruption, and leaving others to clean up the mess he had made of himself and his kingdom.